The war in Vietnam is without a doubt one of the most controversial conflicts that the United States has embroiled itself in during its 250-year span of existence. A brutal conflict that would end up costing nearly 50,000 American lives in combat and around 150,000 more wounded. This, of course, would not even be taking into account the psychological toll of the war on the hundreds of thousands of veterans who came home. Ever since the beginning, the war has been a hot-button issue, as it remains to this day. So why did we get into this controversial conflict? Even with all of the backlash, why did we remain insistent on fighting for around 10 years? This is what we will be talking about today. Let's get started. The rationale for why the United States went to war in Vietnam has multiple pieces, each of which needs to be understood in order to understand the conflict as a whole. However, we need to start even earlier than the US putting troops on the ground to get a full grasp. Vietnam during World War II had been conquered by Japan, and after their withdrawal at the end of the war, Ho Chi Minh, a communist political leader, tried to set up a form of communist government. The French, who had originally colonized Vietnam, did not like this idea, and they tried to set up their own government out of Saigon. This would obviously lead to conflict and the First Indochina War, which took place from 1946 to 1954. This war pitted the French trying to keep a grasp on their colony, and the communist influence taking a grasp of Southeast Asia caught the attention of the United States. It was around this time that President Eisenhower coined the term the domino theory in a press conference in 1954. This idea essentially stated that if French Indochina were to fall to communist influence, the expansion of communism in Asia would be nearly impossible to control. This theory gained a lot of popularity, and the concept would be a staple to American Cold War strategy. In the end, the French couldn't beat back the communist forces, which led to the Geneva Accords of 1954, which was an agreement between Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and France. This had a few key points. First of all, there was to be a ceasefire along the 17th parallel, effectively dividing Vietnam in half, with the communists keeping control in the north and the non-communists control in the south. Alongside this, communist groups and guerrilla fighters were to evacuate Laos and Cambodia, and finally, free elections were to take place in both of those countries, with French troops on standby if requested. With the southern government in place, the U.S. began to lend support in the way of advisors, with the hope of keeping it running as a democratic state. During this time, in the late 50s and early 60s, the United States would build up a military presence in the country. However, it would be strictly non-combatant. Throughout this entire time, the communist North threatened to envelop the South, utilizing raids and other measures to keep them on their toes. With this threat clear, the number of advisors went up during the short Kennedy administration, with the Military Assistance Command Vietnam being established and thousands of troops being stationed there. Eventually, during the Lyndon Johnson administration in 1964, the development was made that would push the U.S. to war. This was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Essentially, troops in the Gulf reported being fired on by North Vietnamese gunboats. There were two claimed incidents, one on August 2nd and the other on August 4th. The attack on the second involved 3 North Vietnamese gunboats and the USS Maddox, where the gunboats attacked the Maddox with torpedo and machine gun fire, according to reports leading to basically no damage, and resulting in 3 gunboats being damaged and only North Vietnamese casualties being reported. The second, however, never actually happened, or at least if it did, it didn't involve any North Vietnamese forces, according to multiple reports, including a declassified NSA study. However, this small incident led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to assist any Southeastern Asian country that was threatened by so-called communist aggression. The immediate result was a campaign of airstrikes against the North Vietnamese and eventual ground operations in 1965. These ground operations would proceed to escalate until the final U.S. withdrawal in 1973. Most people these days will know about the controversy surrounding our involvement in the Vietnam War. With all of this controversy, why did we stay as long as we did, is the question that is often asked. We will get to that, but let's first briefly cover some of the controversial aspects of the Vietnam War. In the beginning, the protests against the war started in liberals, particularly focused on college campuses. They opposed the initial policy and bombings in 1965 and questioned our rationale for entering the conflict. In 1967, opposition really began to pick up as the war began taking its toll on society. By this time, 500,000 troops were deployed to Vietnam, and thousands had died. The draft was also taking thousands of men into the service each month, and the war was dragging heavily on the U.S. taxpayers' dollar. More and more public voices began to speak out, like Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968, the Tet Offensive sent America reeling with its effectiveness on the troops in Vietnam, and a poll at the time showed only 35% of the population supported the war, with 50% against it. A huge organization known as the Vietnam Veterans Against the War began protesting as well, showing that even the military itself wasn't unified in its effort. Protests continued during the election of 1968. Richard Nixon claimed victory, running on an agenda of restoring law and order to the country, both in reference to the anti-war protests and the civil rights protests of the era. He even made a speech claiming that anti-war protesters were a vocal minority in the country. With the invasion of Cambodia and worsening casualties in the region, the outcry only grew louder. In 1971, the first Pentagon Papers were published, exposing some of the harsh realities of America's involvement in Vietnam. These papers turned the public even more against the war. How could the American public justify the atrocities and casualties in a region that nearly none of them had heard of before? And what progress had been made? After nearly 10 years, the war had progressed very little, and it was clear that the American tactics were not going to be able to beat the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. To add more on top of this, in the early 1970s, the U.S. began air and ground operations in Laos and Cambodia in an attempt to shorten the war. This would, however, only make the situation worse, both at home and abroad. So with constant backlash and worsening conditions, why did it take so long for the U.S. to give up and withdraw? Since Nixon had entered office, the amount of troops stationed had already been decreasing, alongside the passion the U.S. had for continuing the conflict. However, the sentiment for many at the time could be summarized by a statement made by future Secretary of State John Kerry, who was a veteran at the time. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? This was one of the primary reasons for the slow withdrawal. It would show the United States as admitting defeat, a huge defeat nonetheless, against a much weaker foe. This shame would not be forgotten quickly on the world stage. And how could it be justified when so many Americans had lost their lives in a foreign country just to give up? In the end, the U.S. would leave after 8 years of being directly involved in the Vietnam conflict. Throughout the latter years, the U.S. had been attempting to broker a peace between the North and South Vietnamese. In January of 1973, an agreement was finally reached and a peace agreement was signed in Paris. It would create a ceasefire in Vietnam and the withdrawal of U.S. forces, release of prisoners of war, and an attempt at reunification of North and South Vietnam through peaceful means. The South Vietnamese government would remain in place, and North Vietnamese forces could not advance further. This agreement essentially was pointless, however, and just a way for the United States to save some of its reputation. The ceasefire was broken soon after, and fighting would resume until 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the final nail in the coffin for the U.S. efforts in Vietnam. The war is still one of the most controversial the U.S. has ever fought, with nearly 60,000 American lives lost and very little to show for it. Hey everybody, Cameron here. I just wanted to pop in real quick and say thank you so much for watching till the end, if you made it this far. If you could, leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I'd really appreciate that. I'm trying to get to 200 subscribers at some point in the near future. We'll see if we make it. But anyway, yeah, thank you again, and I will see you on the flip side.